I'm sure you've heard it all before. It is no secret that session zeros are essential to your pre-campaign setup. However, I believe that all of the talk around session zero is very general and vague. Which makes sense because each DM and group will be running vastly different games and will require different emphasis on different things within their session zero. But despite that, there are many common through lines for most successful session zeros. And so I would like to help you run one of those successful sessions. Let's get into it. Hello everyone, I am the Dungeon Engineer and this is Fantasy Framework, the web series where we go over the step-by-step process for creating a D&D world and campaign from scratch. For those of you who don't know what a session zero is, I'll give a quick definition. It is a session that occurs before the campaign starts where the DM can set up expectations, rules, and direction for the upcoming campaign. Session zeros have always been kind of a weird topic for me because people treat them in a large variety of ways. What I like to do for my session zeros can be different from the next DM, and both of ours can be vastly different from a third DM. And a fourth DM could just not even do session zeros at all. However, most people agree that campaigns are better off with them. So I'm going to try my best to give you a rundown of how to run a session zero for yourself. To do this, we are going to set up a mock session zero for our campaign that we've made in our previous videos. And don't worry if you haven't watched those, the explanations will still make sense regardless of the prior context. I just believe that having a more specific example will help you form what you need to do for yourself. Also, let me know down in the comments if you've run session zeros before and what you like to include in yours. I'm curious on the different ways that you guys like to set up your campaigns. But the first thing that we're going to talk about is campaign introductions. Session zero will be one of the first time when your group all meets up together, whether that be in person or online. Up until now, all of your previous campaign prep should be done either one-on-one or by yourself. However, session zero should be done as an entire group. This session will serve as a time for you to shake off the nerves of a new campaign without actually having to start your new campaign. Also, important tip, you should be scheduling your session zero when you would run your regular sessions. And the first things that you want to cover during your campaign introductions is your player plot hooks, your starting location details, and your first quest line. I talk more about those in my previous videos, just know that they are essentially flavor descriptions of your campaign setting. You want to ensure that everyone is on the same page and knows what type of campaign they are playing. After you establish that, you want to talk about the most important part of any campaign: scheduling and expectations. When creating a session meeting schedule, you have to consider a few things. 1. How frequently are you going to meet? Will it be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, so on and so forth? I could keep going more. 2. How long will each session be? Is it only going to be a couple hours or will it be a full day event? For example, our campaign, let's say we're meeting every other Friday at 7 p.m. for a session length of 3 hours. If you don't have a regular schedule, people are far less likely to be available during the time that you're wanting to play. You may also want to consider talking about other things, like if a player can't make a session, do you end up rescheduling or do you play anyways? What is the cutoff for how many people need to miss a session for you to completely cancel it? And do you want your players to stay off their phones during your game? Can they bring snacks or other beverages or anything like that to the table? It is better to be clear about your expectations now before you have any problems later on. Also, if you have any new players, I would highly recommend giving them a general explanation on how Dungeons and Dragons works. I'm not really going to go into depth for that. That could be a completely different video in of itself, but it should be something you keep in mind. After you make your campaign introductions, it is a good idea to let your players know about any major homebrew rules or elements that you will be implementing within your game. Doing this during Session 0 allows everyone to discuss and agree on all of the rules before any problems arise later on. You want to lay out each rule clearly and concisely, letting your players know how often it will appear within the game as well. You also want to ask your players whether or not they want to play with your homebrew rules and elements. If your players don't like a homebrew rule, you probably shouldn't implement it, or at the very least, you should discuss how you could implement your rules that you want to. One of the major homebrew rules that I always implement within my games is an adjustment to how armor class works. Instead of having a flat AC, each character and creature has a AC range based off of their dexterity and their armor. So if an attack roll lands within this AC range, they take half damage instead of full damage. Obviously, this rule appears very frequently, but only really appears during combat. I would then end up asking my players if they would be alright with running this rule, and if they all agree, then we are good to go. Something I also love to include within my Session Zeros is character introductions. Set aside some time for each player to talk about their character's class, physical description, and maybe a little bit about their backstory. You may also want to take time to build characters for players who haven't made one yet. This would probably be the latest I'd recommend building a character, and I also wouldn't recommend adding any more players beyond this point. Since the goal is to create a campaign and narrative that revolves around your player characters, if they create any more characters beyond this point, it will be very difficult to incorporate them within your story. If their first time showing up with a character is that first session, you have literally zero input from them for your campaign. Side tangent real quick. I've always been of the opinion that your heroes and your characters within your campaign should not be replaceable. If any old adventurer can just be swapped out and inserted in place of your player characters, you have then failed to actually incorporate your player characters within the plot of your campaign. If your players have interesting abilities and backstories, you want to incorporate that within your story because 1, it's easier to do, and 2, it makes it interesting for everyone. So make sure you have all of those characters before your first session. Alright, side tangent, done now, let's keep going. We've got our introductions out of the way, so what now? You could end your Session 0 here and be completely fine. But if you want to go that extra mile, I would highly recommend running an intro combat encounter, an intro roleplay encounter, or both. These encounters will be non-canon to your campaign, but they will serve as a way for your players to get a feel for how combat and roleplay works within your campaign and kind of get a feel for their characters as well. This is especially good for players that have never done anything like D&D before. Even for veteran players, it can take time to get used to a new character's roleplay and combat, and especially if you are playing with a new dungeon master. If you are planning on running either of these encounters, let your players know beforehand. Don't just spring it up on them when they have no idea. Roleplay particularly can be intimidating for new players or players that just aren't comfortable with it. Now let's go into how you might prepare an intro combat or an intro roleplay encounter. When preparing an intro combat encounter, there are a few criteria I'd like to keep in mind. First, and perhaps obviously, you want to create an encounter that is suited for your players. You don't want to completely steamroll your players or give them an encounter that's too easy. I would recommend creating a combat encounter that's roughly 4 or 5 rounds long and gives the players a decent challenge. Second, you want to show off what makes combat within your campaign unique. If you have homebrew rules or homebrew monsters that will show up frequently within combat, make sure you include them within this encounter. For instance, I absolutely love damaging status effects. However, D&D doesn't have a lot of them. So a lot of my homebrew monsters tend to have abilities that involve damaging status effects. If you have something similar to that, I would highly recommend including it within your encounter. And lastly, of course, make it interesting. And you can do this a wide variety of ways. You can use multiple different creatures, use terrain to block lines of sight, or give a secondary objective that is different from just killing monsters. Now let's take a look on how we'd set up an example roleplay encounter. The easiest way to do this would be to create an encounter that leads in or out of the combat encounter that we would prepare for session 0. But for any intro roleplay encounter, I would create some sort of end goal or cutoff to where the roleplay just doesn't go on forever. I would also definitely advise having your roleplay within a confined area so that you don't have to just prep an entire town for just one non-canon roleplay encounter. And like how we discussed for our combat encounter, you also want to keep in mind various different important homebrew rules that may affect roleplay within your campaign. Let's go back to our example campaign and say that we want to make rules for interdimensional portal travel. If you are just joining us for this video, that kind of sounds like a wild statement. Just know that our example campaign world is very high tech, very magic tech vibes, and portal travel, interdimensional travel is a major part within the campaign. So I was thinking for this encounter, maybe there's some sort of interdimensional spacecraft that the players have to operate when traveling between dimensions. If I wanted to come up with homebrew rules on how they would operate that, this would be a fantastic time to test them out. Because not only is this a time for your players to get acclimated, but it is a time for you as a DM as well. Again, these encounters should not be canon to your story. While it should be related in terms of mechanics and theme, when it comes to the actual plot and lore of your campaign, it shouldn't matter at all. This will end up taking weight off of your shoulders and your players' shoulders as well during this time. You can get it out of your head that these encounters need to be perfect. They are just here for everyone to get comfortable with the campaign. Side note, I would not spend more than a page of prep notes on each of these encounters. If you are prepping 5 pages worth of notes for a non-canon short encounter, I shudder to think what your actual campaign notes look like. So now I'm going to flesh out some of the ideas we had for our combat and our roleplay encounters and use them for our example world. We are going to set our roleplay encounter before our combat because that's going to be the easiest thing to do. The second we are done with our roleplay, we can immediately cut it off with combat and not really have to worry about a specific end goal for our roleplay. Both encounters will be taking place within a small spacecraft that is traveling from one dimension to another. The spacecraft itself will have a command center, a general living area, an engine room, and a bunk room. Starting out each roleplay encounter, you want to give a short description of the environment and what each character is doing. For example, I may describe the interior Magitech vibes of the ship itself, or I might describe as the characters are looking out a window and describing the ethereal sight of the void that they are traveling through. I would also provide a few things for your player characters to interact with. Maybe there's some sort of game setup within the main living area of the ship, or the players could interact with the ship's AI that can tell them diagnostics about the ship or tell them about the upcoming mission. You could also maybe have them replace some of the fuel coils that I just made up in the engine room that was running low. You just want to give them stuff to do rather than just sit around and talk. You may also want to have a roleplay encounter that's a little more high stakes than that. Say for instance, one of the wings on the ship was damaged, so one of the player characters has to travel outside into the void while the ship is in motion and repair it. So while one character's outside, the others have to assist him on the inside. The encounter doesn't have to be all that complex, you just want to enable your players to roleplay. Next, for our combat encounter that's going to interrupt our roleplay, the first thing that I thought of was some sort of enemy that boards the ship during travel. And to show off some of my frequent homebrew rules, I'll base it around some aliens that board the ship that have some sort of acid spitting ability. With this acid spitting feature, it not only deals direct damage if it hits, but also a damage over time effect if a player fails their save. Relating back to our roleplay encounter, maybe they are the ones that caused the ship to be damaged. This will make our combat a lot more interesting because not only do the players have to focus on fighting off the aliens, but they have to fix the ship in the meantime. If you don't have any fancy homebrew rules or monsters, that's perfectly okay. Just pull monsters from the monster manual that match your player's power. For these encounters, I would plan for an hour or so of gameplay. Since your Session 0 is going to involve a lot more stuff than these encounters, you don't want to overwhelm your players with these encounters. You can also use these encounters to get a grasp of your pacing and general encounter prep. While you run through these encounters, keep track of time that it takes for them to get through the roleplay and the combat encounter. And with that, you can then use it as a baseline going forward for your future prep. I believe that running your Session Zeros like this allows you to obtain and provide the most useful information for your upcoming campaign. If you're wanting a simpler Session Zero, you can of course always just leave out the intro roleplay and intro combat encounter, but if you do that, I would highly recommend incorporating those similar philosophies for your first session. I just personally like doing them during my Session 0 because I don't have to rely on as much trial and error during my actual campaign. If you liked this video, please check out my other video on how to create a balanced homebrew class from scratch. I go into some of the math and philosophy on how to design a homebrew class. And of course, like and subscribe if you would like to see more of this web series. With all that being said, bye for now.